is.
Okay.
It's
Okay,
super.
It's not an actual rock.
Um,
There's a lot of junk.
I
Feel
know.
free to use any of it.
There we go. Maybe this will help it stay. Okay, cool. All right.
Okay.
I'm going to face it more towards you
Okay.
because people don't
Let's
know.
scoot forward a bit here.
Okay, cool. And that's just like a secondary thing. We'll
Sure.
focus more on this here. Just want to do a mic check, so like spell your name.
Lee Banville, Leebanville.
And political analysis.
I'm a political analyst and a professor of journalism.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so obviously big news today coming out of the Bullock camp.
Mm-hmm.
Running for president in 2020 amongst 22 other people, I believe.
Currently.
Yeah.
So we haven't checked it a little while, so who knows?
What are your thoughts just when you hear that news?
I mean, I can't say that I'm surprised. He's been laying the groundwork for months, really. I mean, going to New Hampshire, going to Iowa a lot, building a much stronger social media presence. So, I mean, he was giving every indication that this was the way he was headed, and that he was really waiting until the end of the legislative session to really make a final decision. But it seemed like he'd already made a decision, and it was he was waiting for the appropriate time to roll it out.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. We kind of joked about how he's announcing that he's going to make a big announcement, and there's this anticipation of, okay, we already kind of know what he's going to do, but now we do know for sure, I guess, with this morning's news.
He's definitely gone public with it.
Yeah. So what kind of infrastructure does this take for him? I mean, he doesn't have the national name like a Biden or a Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
So what does this take?
So his campaign is really going to rely on grassroots. He's going to have to go out to, especially these early states, and build a sort of name recognition there. So even if people in California don't know who he is right now, that's okay. What he needs is Democratic activists on the ground in Iowa and New Hampshire in particular to really respond to his message and really buy into the idea that although it's a long shot, he's the kind of leader that this country needs and that the Democrats need at this moment.
And I mean, if we learned anything from 2016, it's that really anybody can get in there and make a name for themselves and get voted in as president. So, there's these people who are like, oh, this is such a long shot. But then there's kind of like this whole idea, well, at this point, anybody can get in there. Do you think that's what he's banking on?
Well, I mean, I do think that his challenge is his biggest problem, which is the sheer number of people running for president. On the one hand, that creates a huge problem for him because how do you stand out in a field of candidates where you are the third governor to get in, the third from the West? You can list the things that he tries to differentiate himself from the other candidates. He stresses his sort of bipartisan approach. Well, so does Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. I mean, there's not a sort of spot where you can be like, oh, that's just Steve Bullock. He is that guy. But on the flip side, because there are so many people running, the support of Democratic voters are going to be spread so thin over these 20 plus candidates over the next 6 months as they sort of start to jockey for who's going to really make it to the sort of real primary. That I think he does have this opportunity to kind of carve out a niche that is, that some of the Democratic voters respond to, and if he can kind of rally support around him, he may be able to turn it. But it's going to be it's a crapshoot, and I think it's going to be a hard campaign for him to differentiate himself. But he's banking on the message of like there's a Montana way of getting stuff done. And he's banking on the message of campaign finance reform. And if enough people sort of rally around that, he could sort of thread the needle and pull that off.
Yeah. So, I mean, Montana is a red state, people would say.
Presidentially. Yeah.
And he's been elected twice as governor, as a Democrat, in a presidential red state. So there is, his first campaign video was very much like, I can do this. I work with both sides. And I think he said, I do more than work with Democrats. I have to talk with both sides. I mean, he was voted in a red state.
Right.
So, do you think in the huge number of Democrats running in 2020, who is his biggest threat in that central leftist kind of spot?
Probably the vice president. So Joe Biden has also sort of carved out this blue collar, kind of regular Joe sort of candidate or supporter. He's not just the sort of coasts, the elitists. And so he's tried to carve that position out. I think former Governor Hickenlooper from Colorado is running a very similar campaign where he sort of says that he can work, these executives who run states kind of make the case that I'm not just a politician, I have to get the job done. And if you want someone who can work across the aisle, who can kind of stitch together a coalition to get real effective change, you need that kind of leader, not just somebody who gets up and throws red meat to the liberal audience because they don't get stuff done when you get to the executive mansion.
Yep.
And so I think his biggest challenge is going to be sort of fending off those who would be like, well, Joe Biden kind of makes the same argument and a lot more people know him. Or if you're looking for that governor's experience, Jay Inslee out of Washington or Hickenlooper out of Colorado, both kind of argue that same position. And so he's got to really look for that issue that's going to make him unique. And I think the issue he is really hammering right now is campaign finance reform.
Yeah, and I kind of want to switch gears to the amount of women running for 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this kind of political climate right now that's really focusing on women in politics, and it's great. I mean, that's kind of the shift this last 4 years, I feel like, has been really highlighted in
Right.
women in politics. Do you find it, ironic, I guess, that there's a white man Democrat running against these women, and this is kind of this like atmosphere where like there's a lot of people that want to see a female in office.
So I do think that's going to be one of the things he has to deal with, which is he is a 50-something white guy, and that does not do a lot to differentiate yourself. I mean, a lot of the people running for the Democratic nomination are 50 or 60-year-old white guys. And that is, I think any candidate for the Democratic nomination really has to figure out how do they connect with women who feel disenfranchised by the political process over the last, whether you're talking about Brett Kavanaugh, you're talking about the Hillary Clinton election. There's a lot of women who just feel like the political process has not treated them well because it frankly hasn't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that what we have to do is, the Bullock or whoever we're talking about on the Democratic side is going to have to address that in some very real way. And I don't think that's by making sure you have enough women in your campaign ads. It's really got to be sort of a genuine outreach that feels to female voters, which is a very diverse group. I mean, there aren't women voters. That their frustrations are being heard and addressed in a very specific way. It's a hard thing to answer for a candidate who's still trying to kind of make a name for himself.
Exactly. So he has like this, it's uphill battle really for him right now, I feel like. And then, there's a lot of critics that are saying, and there's a lot of Democrats in Montana here that are saying, why spend all this money to, this long shot for presidency when, the Democratic Party actually might need you here as a senator running against Daines in 2020.
You've definitely heard some grumbling from the Democratic side, in particular in Washington, about they would have much rather had Bullock as a candidate against Steve Daines in 2020. And I think, there's probably something to this, but, it's also, if Steve Bullock feels like he can contribute to the national conversation more effectively by running for president and trying to reshape the Democratic Party or build a name for himself either for this race or for a future race, I think you can't make a person run for an office that they don't want. And if he's like, look, I've seen what's going on in the Senate, and John Tester is great, but I don't want to be another one. I think that the Democrats are going to have to figure out how to address that because right now they do have a candidate for Senate. in Wilmot Collins for the Helena mayor. But I think, there's a lot of questions about whether Bullock should really run, and I think they're just going to have to deal with the fact that he wants to run for president.
Yep. And then, as a whole, let's say he does get the Democratic nomination.
Wow.
Let's say that. Yeah, let's say that.
Okay.
How does he kind of market himself to these, really extreme Democrats that really want like a Bernie Sanders or like a Beto, in that position? How does he get those people, along with he has to take some voters away from the Republican Party to kind of, win?
So in some ways, it's easier to see how Steve Bullock sells himself to the American public generally than how he sells himself to the Democratic base who are going to vote in these primary elections. Because he is not a flame-throwing liberal. And when you get on social media and you do your quick donation to the person who said the most yes, I love that kind of thing, if you're a liberal Democrat, it's probably not Steve Bullock. I mean, it's going to be Bernie Sanders. It's going to be Elizabeth Warren. It's going to be, I can't ever say his name, Buttigieg. Buttigieg. Yeah. I mean, there are these different candidates who are going to really appeal to like your heart. And Bullock is kind of a head candidate, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, on the issues, he's gotten stuff done. He got Medicaid expansion passed in a Republican-dominated legislature. He really has pushed campaign finance reform fairly effectively at the state level, but that's all up in the brain. The challenge is the primaries are often about the heart, and the heart and the brain don't always line up. And so the question is, can he get enough Democrats to be like, I wish he were more outspoken about Medicare for all, or you name the sort of liberal agenda. But I'm going to vote for him because he gets stuff done, and I think he could appeal to those moderate Republicans or moderate Democrats who felt disenfranchised in 2016. And so I'm going to vote for him. Then he's got a potential recipe for winning. But I think that's the hard thing, because when you look at like this modern campaign environment that's really fueled by social media, his is not the one that you're going to get very excited about. It's the one that you're going to be like, oh, yes, I think that's smart.
Safe or smart.
Smart.
Yeah,
exactly. And I don't know if that's how, maybe that's how people will feel as things get closer. But I think typically people, Democrats are really frustrated by President Trump, and they really want to beat him.
Yeah.
And they want to beat him, but the question is, do they want to beat him by finding that moderate candidate, or do they want to find like a liberal, like extreme on the other side to kind of counteract him? And that's what we're going to have to wait and see.
So as this, plays out, we're all going to be watching, and we're going to see this entire political atmosphere change and up to 2020. And some would say that since there's such a high number of Democrat candidates, that this is just going to be a bloodshed, one for one. But do you think that after 2016, that's really what voters want to see at this point? Especially the Democratic Party, who's kind of been, just trying to stay, afloat, you could say, in the Trump era.
Right.
And are we all sick of that? Do we want these candidates supporting one another, but just maybe talking about their differences in certain little things, or is it going to be just like one for one?
I think it's gonna. It will be interesting to see, because I mean the Republican primary process in 2016 was kind of a bloodbath where they attacked each other. It was very mean. It was very personal. It was insulting a lot of the time to each other. And so the Democrats thus far have not done that, but it's very early. And so when push comes to shove, and when we get closer to people actually casting ballots, I think right now what you're going to see is a very quiet campaign of, insiders and political, sort of politically powerful sort of folks trying to winnow the field down before we even get close to voters voting, so that when you get to Iowa or New Hampshire, you're talking about 10 candidates or 12 candidates, not 23.
Yeah.
because I think what they want is, it's okay to have a sort of range of candidates, but if you really end up with a super fractured field, it becomes more unpredictable, and you might end up with a candidate that is that does not help you nationally, right? That appealed to a very set group that was very excited about that candidate, but that the American public is like, no, thank you. And so that's what we're going to have to see is, does the field start to shrink, or does it keep growing? And at what point do we actually start to see, like, of the three governors running, are all three going to make it to Iowa even, or are we going to actually see one? And if so, is that the person who then makes the case that I'm an executive who can get things done?
Yeah.
Because that's easier to do when you're making that case and you're the only one making that case, versus you're one of three or four who are trying to say the same thing.
So, at this point, what does President Donald Trump have going for him in the sense of there's just so many candidates? I mean, how can we even get on board with one person at this point?
What's funny is I think the thing that Donald Trump has going for him right now is President Trump has an incredibly strong economy, right? Every month we see wages are going up, people are doing better, unemployment's at record lows, and so historically that is your ticket to re-election. Now, if the Democrats spend the next 6 months sort of shooting each other, that's added bonus. But in some ways, I would be watching, the volatile stock market and the trade conflict with China as much as I'm watching, does Iowa like Steve Bullock or Jay Inslee? Because when all is said and done, that may have more to say about what happened. I mean, historically, if you look at the data, that may have more to say about who gets elected than, is it a moderate governor from, a western state, or is it a liberal senator from an eastern state?
Yeah, it's really going to shape the next 3 years until 2 years.
2 years.
2 years, next 2 years of what people want. And it's, I mean, if it's, more of a, like you said, heart over head, what are people looking for is really going to shape that. So anything else you'd like to add before I kind of shut off the camera here?
I mean, I think, I do think what'll be interesting is if Governor Bullock gains some traction, it will be to see how Montana is perceived nationally. Because most people, when they think of Montana, they think of it, it's a red state, right? Everybody says that. It's a red state. And when you look at the presidential elections, it is. In fact, my guess is that Steve Bullock would lose Montana to Donald Trump.
Yes.
Which is funny to say. But I think, what's interesting is, I mean, this Montana way of Democrats and Republicans actually working together to get things done could become a real national story. It would be interesting to see that story play out, because I think, there has been a lot of stuff that has happened in this state, even though it's a pretty deeply divided, red state with a couple of big blue islands in it. And they've gotten a lot of stuff done in the last, 4 and 8 years. And so if he gets some traction, I think you'll see a lot of attention focused on, well, how does Montana get it done and Congress can't? Which might be an interesting story.
Which is actually interesting that you say that, because, Trump visited this last summer 4 times before the 2018 elections, trying to get in Rosendale and advocating for him. But Tester still blew that really out of the water, that election. So it is interesting in Montana. We say we're a red state, but you see Tester won again. Governor Bullock won back in 2016. I mean,
I will say it's trending more and more Republican. I think that just look at. I mean, we don't have a Democratic governor candidate, and that's kind of shocking. I'm sure we will, but we don't have a clear. Oh, this is the one who's going to obviously run for governor. Like there are several on the Republican side, and so I think there is. Although Bullock and Tester have both shown that we are not a Republican state through and through, the Democrats haven't got a lot of people to run against these candidates anymore. And that may be the biggest sort of concern longer term, is that the Democrats really need to kind of re-energize its sort of field of candidates, because there aren't a lot.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Sure.
Appreciate it.